Hello and welcome to another video by AIA Contract Documents. In this video we're going to be talking about the CARES Act, which is short for the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. Amongst other things, we'll be talking about the Paycheck Protection Program, how to qualify for loans, recent developments in federal stimulus programs, including the fact that the President just signed into law a new $484 billion stimulus package that adds funds to certain programs in the CARES Act. My name is Mike Koger, and I'm joined by my colleague Jimmy Germano. We are both staff attorneys for the American Institute of Architects in Washington, D.C., and we work in the Contract Documents Department. In this video, we're joined by Kara Kemsky. Kara is Manager of Federal Relations at the AIA, and she has been following the federal stimulus efforts closely over the last few weeks. As always, we cannot give legal advice in this video, and nothing you hear in this video is a substitute for consulting with an attorney who is licensed in your jurisdiction who can talk with you about the specific issues you're facing. So with that, Jimmy, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Mike. Before we go ahead and talk to the expert herself, Ms. Kara Kemsky, I did want to let people know about two kind of specific resources that the AIA has right now. And the first is this very good and in-depth webinar sort of description of the CARES Act, and you can see it on your screen, what architects and firms need to know about the federal coronavirus stimulus plan. And that's an hour-long, in-depth, very informative discussion that we're going to touch on some of these today, but if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, that's a great place to start. And there's also some FAQs on the AIA website, and you can access them via aia.org. And if you want to learn a little bit more again about what we're talking today, these FAQs would be a great place to start, and there's additional resources on there as well. With that, I will turn it over to Ms. Kara Kemsky, and I will start by just asking, Kara, if you could, can you just tell us a little bit about your role at the AIA and your experience?
Sure. Thanks for having me on this today. I really appreciate it. As was mentioned, my name is Kara Kemsky. I'm the Director of Federal Relations here at the AIA. I've been working with AIA for about 2 years now, and before that I worked for 5 years as a federal lobbyist for another membership organization, a nonprofit that worked with law enforcement on community development issues. So I've been in the DC area for over 7 years now, working on federal policy.
We are very excited to have you. So without further ado, let's sort of jump right into this. Get to the question that's maybe on the top of everyone's mind if they're clicking on this video and taking a look at it, and that is, what is the CARES Act in a nutshell?
The CARES Act is the third major piece of legislation that Congress has passed in response to COVID-19. It was passed on March 27th and signed into law on the same day. It's a far-reaching piece of legislation. The whole thing was well over 800 pages. It includes a mixture of economic stimulus ideas, protections for workers, and injections of funding into a lot of sectors of society.
From what I understand about the CARES Act, it's a government plan. It's a package that provides funds to small and medium-sized businesses. But one thing that's unclear to me is are the CARES Act funds, are they a loan? Are they a grant? Are they both? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is some of both. So one of the biggest, probably most famous parts of the CARES Act is the Paycheck Protection Program. That one is targeted to small businesses. It's important to note that small business under this legislation is somewhat different than it's normally characterized. They don't have some of the requirements that are usually in place. It's just if you employ 500 employees or fewer. So it's a wider net than normal. But how the Paycheck Protection Program works, it sets up a loan that can be up to $10 million, and the interest rate on that loan is 1%. But the piece of it that a lot of folks are talking about is the portion of that loan that can be forgiven. So depending on what you spend that loan on for the first 8 weeks, if you spend it only on eligible expenses, that portion of your loan can be forgiven. So the eligible expenses are also broken into two categories. You have to spend 75% at least of that money on just payroll expenses. That includes salary and also health benefits. And then up to 25% can be spent on other eligible expenses around your operating costs, like rent or your mortgage. So if you only spend the money on those things and you keep your salary the same, the salary expenses that you're paying the same, so you don't cut salaries and you don't cut the number of employees As long as those levels stay the same and you only spend it on those eligible uses, that portion of your loan is then forgiven. The rest remains a loan. Another really important one for small businesses is the Emergency Economic Injury Disaster Loan, or EIDL. This one is strictly a loan. No portion of it is forgiven if you receive the loan. However, if you apply for this, you potentially can receive a $10,000 advance. If you don't get the loan, that $10,000 becomes just a grant. You don't have to repay that. And I think the thinking there is that they want people to apply for this money and spend it in the immediate term to cover your immediate expenses. So there's no penalty to you if you ultimately don't get the rest of the loan. If you do get the loan, that $10,000 then is part of what you repay. And then another thing I wanted to point out within this that's not a loan but also has potentially a significant economic impact is the Employee Retention Tax Credit. This is for any business side, not just the small businesses, and it has some distinctions for if you have over or under 100 employees, but basically it's a refundable payroll tax credit for the first $10,000 of compensation to an eligible employee paid between March 13th through December 31st. So that's another incentive within the bill to try to help employers keep people employed.
Gotcha. So one of the things you touched on right at the end was the tax credit, and with reference to sort of tax issues and how entities can be set up. And I know that, like for example, nonprofits or certain entities can be set up as like 501c3s versus 501c6s. Do those types of entities qualify for CARES Act assistance, or are they excluded?
So they qualify, but they qualify in different ways. So if you are a 501c3, you're eligible for anything else based on just all of the other qualifications that the law sets up. Your 501c3 status does not disqualify you for anything. If you are a 501c6, however, you are not eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program, which is often abbreviated to PPP. You are eligible for the emergency EIDL that I mentioned and the Employee Retention Tax Credit and some other provisions, but you are not eligible for the PPP as it stands right now. That is something that AIA is actively working on. Me and other members of our team have been lobbying Congress to change that, but for right now, that is how it stands.
So you referenced this a little bit before when you were introducing the CARES Act. You had said I think that it was passed on March 27th, if I remember correctly. But today is April 24th, 2020, and reading the news last night, my understanding is kind of a new wave of the CARES Act was passed. Can you just talk a little bit about this recent update and how that works with the structure of the act?
Yes, so the Paycheck Protection Program and the Emergency EIDL ran through their funding. So in the first round in the CARES Act, the PPP got $349 billion, and that was entirely expended by about April 16th. Some of the calculations around that were a little different, but basically last week that ran out of funds. So this next round replenished that. It added another $321 billion for the PPP, so that total now is about $670 billion. It also put another $10 billion toward the emergency EIDL, $50 billion to additional small business loan disaster loans, and then another $75 billion for hospitals and $25 billion for testing. It did not make major policy changes, and so understanding the CARES Act as the framework is still really important because that sets up a lot of the rules that govern how these loans work, but it did inject some much needed resources since so many businesses did apply. Unfortunately, we're able to take advantage of this loan, but many more are still waiting.
So that was actually going to be my next question, was all of the issues that you've already talked about and some that we'll get into here in a minute, like the 501c3 differentiation, all of that is the same. It's just, they basically just refilled the coffers of money that were sitting there available to companies. Is that sort of a good way to look at it?
Yes, I think that's a good way to think of it. There's some talk about doing a much bigger package that could include certainly more funding, but then also some policy changes. The timing on that is unclear, but that's something we are actively working on and that I think many folks who work with Capitol Hill are expecting in the coming weeks, at least some progress on that front.
Mike Coger, do you have a question?
Yeah, Kara, if I'm a architect working in private practice, if I own a firm, I'm probably most thinking about the Paycheck Protection Program because as I understand it, it's the only one that offers loan forgiveness. So first of all, do I have that right? Is this the only one that does offer the loan forgiveness feature? And a second part to that question, I know a lot of my friends are solo practitioners. Is there anything about this that can help solo practitioners? They, I guess they do to some degree write themselves a paycheck, but it's not like they have a workforce that they are trying, a payroll that they are trying to keep going. Anything you know about that?
Yes. So sole practitioners are eligible for the PPP. And the amount of the loan that you can apply for is based on your payroll, and I think it's 2.5 times your payroll expenses over a certain period. And so even if you're paying yourself, that's still money that you need. And so yes, sole proprietors can apply for that. What was the other part of your question, the first part?
Well, I just wanted to make sure, is this PPP program the only one that qualifies for forgiveness?
Yes. So with kind of the caveat of the $10,000 advance that you don't have to pay back for the EIDL, with that caveat aside, yes, the PPP is the one that comes with a certain portion of that potentially forgivable. The other loans do not.
Gotcha. And I assume that's why we've seen so much money has already gone through that program. The initial $349 billion has already been exhausted, and now there's an additional 320. Is that has been approved for that PPP program, correct?
Right. Yep. Another 321-ish billion to round it out to 670 total.
Okay. And a follow-up question, I suppose, is can you talk a little bit about what we know so far about forgiveness? This is a relatively new program. The money's obviously moving, but I imagine there's going to be quite a few architects out there over the next few months that are looking to try to get these loans forgiven. Do we know anything about how that process works, how quickly it's supposed to work, and what you have to, the kind of hoops you have to jump through to get that forgiven?
Absolutely. So some of this we are figuring out as we go, as Treasury continues to release more guidance. I think that this is going to be something that where members have various experiences, if they can share that with us, that would be very helpful in any follow-up lobbying that we do to try to make this program more effective. But the way it stands right now, the plan is you apply for forgiveness from your bank. So I should have mentioned that at the top. For the PPP, you apply through an SBA-approved lending institution, which could be your bank, could be not your normal bank, but look for another one. And so you apply for forgiveness in the same way. You don't start repaying those loan payments until 6 months. They're deferred for 6 months automatically. In that period of time, you can apply for the loan forgiveness, and you're supposed to find out the decision on that forgiveness within 60 days, and that should come from your bank. I think there's going to need to be more guidance that comes out as this gets closer, but that's the basic framework for now. As far as the things that you need to send your loan servicer for part of that application, you need documentation verifying the number of full-time equivalent employees on payroll and pay rates for the periods in question, and that can include payroll tax filings, state income payroll, unemployment insurance filings. You also need documentation including canceled checks, payment receipts, transcripts of accounts or other documents verifying payments on the covered expenses on your operating costs, like your mortgage obligations or lease, that sort of thing. And then you also have to make a certification that everything that you're saying is true and correct, and that the amount for which forgiveness is requested was used to retain employees, make interest payments on covered mortgage obligation, make payments on covered rent obligation, or make covered utility payments.
Yeah, so it sounds like best practices would really be to start documenting things and collecting your documents on what you've spent now, rather than 2 months from now when you've already, things have gotten a little muddy there in your email account somewhere. So start that file right now.
Absolutely, and some of the experience that different members will have will be based on your lending institution. They may ask for some more documentation. I think it's best to be over-prepared and to reach out to your lending institution throughout the process and make sure that you guys are on the same page for what they're going to need, because it is up to that entity, not the Treasury, to set some of this process, even though Treasury establishes the guidelines and the overall framework. Work with your bank directly.
Kara, I have a question sort of as you were talking there about the various architecture firms that are on the receiving end of some of these funds, and and how that might work. I know that some design firms are set up as pass-through entities, like an S Corp or something like that. How does the CARES Act affect like an S Corp's ability to receive funds?
Yes, so there are a couple other provisions within the CARES Act outside of the loans that we were just talking about on the tax side that do impact pass-through entities. And so you should note that that's about 60%. I think our latest survey said about 57% of architecture firms are organized as pass-through entities or S Corps. So it's definitely something worth looking at. But what the CARES Act does is it temporarily suspended the loss limitations that firms were currently under. So it enables pass-throughs to temporarily deduct more expenses against their tax liability this year, including capital gains. And so it undoes some of the changes that were put into place by the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And what it's intended to do is you can carry back some of the losses that you're having this year against your tax liability from 2018 and 2019. And so the idea is basically take another look at your taxes and see if you might be able to get some of that money back. And the idea is just to increase liquidity in the short term. That portion has been under some scrutiny. And folks may have seen in the news that there's some question about that potentially disproportionately benefiting the highest earners. But as it stands right now, that pass-through provision has been temporarily suspended, and some architecture firms should be able to benefit from that.
How about the size of the firm? I had heard on the news something about if you have 500 employees, like over or under, or a lower number of employees than that. How does a design firm's size affect their ability to use CARES Act funds?
So if you want to apply for either the PPP or the emergency EIDL, you need to have 500 or fewer employees. Some of the other provisions, though, are for all sizes. So the employee retention tax credit, for example, that I mentioned is a great one that would be open potentially to a firm of any size. One thing to note about the PPP is if you apply for that, that negates your eligibility for some of the other provisions, including the employee retention tax credit. So you have to make a choice of which one would benefit you the most. You also can't apply for an EIDL and a PPP at the same time. At least you can't receive both. If you already received an EIDL before, there's some work-throughs that you could combine them, but basically the rule is one or the other. And so some of the other provisions in the bill are also targeted at much bigger firms and much bigger business entities. There are some that are targeted at employers of 500 to 10,000 or more. So the law does distinguish between business types. Probably what it's best known for is the PPP and the EIDL, which are targeted at the smaller businesses.
So, Carol, while we're on the topic of how to qualify for these kinds of loans, I can remember back a few weeks ago when the CARES Act was first out and people were talking about it. I was talking with a friend of mine who's an architect. He runs a fairly small firm, and his initial reaction was, well, I don't think I qualify. I've probably lost some work due to the economic downturn. People aren't doing home renovations or smaller commercial projects for restaurants. But he really couldn't put a finger on, yeah, I lost this particular project or I've lost this amount of money. Can you talk a little bit about the standard that someone who runs a small business has to meet? My understanding is a fairly low bar. You don't have to definitively show that you've missed out on a job or missed out on some money. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So for the PPP, for an example, to start there, it does require a certification, but I think you're right that it's not necessarily dependent on one specific project that was then postponed or canceled. The way it's described in the bill is, quote, that the uncertainty of current economic conditions makes necessary the loan request to support the ongoing operations of the eligible recipient. So I think that allows for a lot of discretion at the business owners. Put that a different way. It allows the business owner to use their discretion to say that it's the economic conditions broadly that are creating uncertainty for their future economic status and their current economic status. If you don't feel that your firm is currently experiencing any economic hardship, that might be a different situation. But if there is uncertainty in your work, then it's worth looking into.
So it's not the kind of thing that an architecture firm has to have like an X% drop in receipts or something like that to qualify?
No, there's no percentage. And that's for the PPP. If you look at the emergency EIDL, it has a slightly different certification that requires you to be in a disaster area, and we now are in a national disaster declaration, and it requires you to certify economic hardship in the immediate term. And so it can be a little different depending on what you're applying for. So it's always worth talking with an accountant, general counsel, or another expert to figure out exactly what makes sense for you and which loan you should or may choose not to apply for. But yes, there's nothing in the bill that is so specific as to say you have to certify, a 15% reduction in output or a 50%. It's nothing like that. It's the economic uncertainty is enough if you can certify that it impacts you and your work.
Switching gears, perhaps to something a little bit more optimistic. Has your team or have you heard of anyone at the AIA perhaps communicating with a design firm with maybe a success story about these funds and how they were used, or maybe even a failure story on not being able to receive the funds, just so that we can maybe use that as a something other design firms should know about?
Yeah, we have received some good news from some members in the last couple of weeks that they received a PPP. That's probably the main one that we're hearing about, and that it's providing certainty in this immediate period, and that they know that they can retain staff for at least the next 8 weeks. And so that's been great to hear. There have also been some members who've reached out to say that they haven't heard back from their bank and what are their next steps. So for that, I would say with this new set of funding that now has been added to the PPP, make sure to be proactive. Apply if you didn't apply before and you're interested. Reapply if you never heard back. If you were approved for an SBA loan, but then the funding ran out and you were told by your lender that funding is not available even though their application was approved, follow up on that. I think it's important to be proactive because the volume of cases is so high. But if you were already approved, you should get a loan within 10 days. So there are immediate next steps that firms can certainly take. I think we fully expect this next set of funding to go quickly as well. So time really is of the essence if this is of interest to the individual firm to reach out to their lender.
Kara, we might have already said this at some point in this video, but it is my understanding that the Paycheck Protection Program is first come, first served. So there is not just an immediacy for there being funds there, but get yourself in line to get those funds, especially now that there are some new funds available, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. For the Paycheck Protection Program and the EIDL, these are first come, first serve. I should note, I don't think I did say this before, for the emergency EIDL, that you apply to the SBA directly, the Small Business Administration. For the PPP, you apply to a lending institution, but both of which do require you to get your application in quickly, because when these funds are spent, they're spent.
Kara, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to maybe ask a follow-up on it, and that's what's taking a step back. What is the AIA doing now, just generally with respect to the CARES Act? Kind of what can members expect in the next weeks and months with respect to lobbying efforts? What might be coming down the pike from Congress or from the president? What's going on there?
Yes, so we have been very engaged with Capitol Hill on these immediate COVID response measures. We were pushing to see additional funding for the PPP and the emergency EIDL, so very appreciative of this new round of funding. But we're continuing to work on what comes next. I think probably more funding from this will also be necessary to cover the economic impact that so many firms are feeling. We also, as we mentioned at the top, think that 501c6 entities should be eligible for the PPP, so working to change that. And then looking longer term, we think that a full-fledged economic recovery is going to require infrastructure investment. That's something AIA has supported for many years. It's no secret that infrastructure has been somewhat left to languish, and that it's an important and pretty powerful economic recovery tool. As we always say, buildings are infrastructure, and that there's a lot of opportunity out there to retrofit our existing building stock to be more sustainable, higher performing, and also to think through some of the vulnerabilities that we have seen now with the COVID-19 crisis, whether that's rethinking some of the layouts of interior space, thinking about our hospital surge capacity, especially in rural areas, which we recognize now is likely not sufficient, rethinking schools and what they need. And then of course, affordable housing. Sheltering in place is only possible if you have somewhere to shelter. So that's what we're working on, and we think that there is a bipartisan appetite to do something around infrastructure. There are also disagreements on what infrastructure is and how much money should be spent. So there's a lot of work for us to do on that front, but I think it's something that at different points the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the White House have all signaled that they want to do, and so we're trying to make sure that the architect's perspective is included in that.
That's a great point, and it's I don't know if exciting or fun is the right word, but it is sort of a potential positive to think about what can come out of this. And I know you were talking about like sustainable design and like maybe using sustainable design as a triggering mechanism to jumpstart the economy going forward. Maybe let's start to focus on that, get more buildings built, retrofit structures, that kind of thing. So it is, it's, if you want to choose to look at the positive, that's, potential positive that can come out of this that you just pointed out. And I think that's important for people to think about and recognize.
Absolutely. I think, we're hopeful for continued work with the Hill and with the administration on, what else communities need. And at the top of that list for a long time has been infrastructure investment. And so I think it's going to take continued work, certainly with AI members weighing in, us working with partner organizations, and then hearing directly from the communities that our members work in. What is it that they need most immediately in the intermediate term and the long term? And that's really helpful for us to be able to relay to the people making these decisions on where our money needs to go.
We're talking here for maybe a half hour or so about the CARES Act, and let's say you have a solo practitioner, a small firm, architect who's listening to this and says that this is very helpful, but it's a little overwhelming. There's so much information, there's so much to do. Someone with your expertise on these issues, if you had to pick like 2 or 3 things that architect needs to know, what would they be?
I think probably the most important things to note for the loans that we've been talking about today, the PPP and the EIDL, is that they are first come, first serve. And so if you are interested in receiving those loans at all, it's better to get your documentation in order, work with general counsel if you are so inclined, or an accountant to figure out exactly what you need and what your situation is, but then proactively and aggressively go after that loan. I think from there, the other thing that I would note that we haven't touched on that's also included in the CARES Act is that there are some provisions around student loan debt. So for employers who have employees who have student loans, there is a change in the CARES Act that temporarily waives a restriction that they can now, they previously couldn't, but they can now pay back a student loan debt of their employee in the same way that they do for a retirement fund. Usually that's not allowed, but in this particular case, that has been waived. And so if the employee and the employer choose to do so, you can help your employees pay off their student loan debt through the CARES Act. It's still there, it comes directly from their salary, it's not additional money, but it works the same way as you would do for a retirement plan. The other thing for those with student loan debts that's worth noting is that everyone has been placed on automatic forbearance for the next 6 months. So you can continue to make payments in this time if you want to, but you don't have to. And forbearance is the one where it basically presses pause and you don't continue to accrue interest over that period. So that was put into place in mid-April, but they retroactively extended that policy back to mid-March. So if you made a payment toward the end of March and you don't want to have made that payment, it's worth checking out to see if you can get that refunded.
Interesting. Okay. That's very helpful.
One more question, Kara, and you may or may not know this, but do we know what the interest rates are on these loans? At least I saw somewhere that the PPP loans were, for the portions that don't get forgiven, was something like 1%. Is that true? And do you know about the other loans as well, what those interest rates are?
Yes, so it is true. For the PPP, it's a fixed rate 1% loan. For anything else, it's not forgiven. For the emergency EIDL, that $10,000 advance, is somewhat different from the rest of your loan, but the rest of the loan, depending on some details of your specific case, is either 2.75% or 3.75% interest on that loan.
Interesting. Okay. I actually have one more question, but before I ask, I want to check Mike Koger. Do you have anything else to ask Kara? Anything else you want to talk about?
No, thank you, Kara, for taking the time to shoot this video with us and also for taking all the time to read all the stuff that Congress passes that even the senators don't read. So thanks for doing that for us.
Thanks. Well, we have a great team at AIA, so we all took pieces of it and were able to put out some guidance on the 880-page bill and then the subsequent bill quickly, and so hopefully that has been helpful for folks. But yeah, fortunately, it's not just me. So,
if an architect wanted to find additional resources about the CARES Act, what other resources does the AIA have available, or sort of anything else you know about if they wanted to look further?
Yes, so we have been sending out a weekly COVID-19 update email that includes resources on a variety of policy and practice guidance. I think those weekly blasts have been very helpful. If you go to the website, there's also a dedicated section to COVID-19 resources that, again, looks at practice implications as well, but has a full policy section. And so the FAQ document that you mentioned is up there. We actually also just updated it to reflect the increase in funding. So that's on there. The webinar that you mentioned at the top, where we brought in some of our consultants who specialize in small business loans, that included a pretty extensive Q&A toward the end of that webinar, and so that was able to cover a lot of ground as well. We've been sending a lot of emails to membership through our government advocacy committee chairman, Tim Hawk. He's been great in helping us to communicate with members all of the ways that they can get involved and any updates from Capitol Hill that we think are really time sensitive and important. So keep an eye out for those as well. And we're going to continue to try to communicate during this period. As I mentioned, we expect there to be more legislation. You know, as folks have probably seen in the news, there's some discussion now and some disagreement over whether states and local government need funding from the federal government. Certainly, potentially additional funding for hospitals, for testing, for NIH, and then all of the business concerns that we talked about, as well as an infrastructure package that we think is critical to restart some of our economic engines. So I think all of that is going to be continuing to percolate over the next couple of months, and so we'll try to make sure that AIA members are both represented in those discussions and then also that they know about them.
Kara, those are all the questions that I have. I can't thank you enough for taking the time, like Mike Koger said, to chat with us today. I think it's been very informative. I think architects are going to find it to be incredibly informative in this space we're in right now, where information is just a deluge of information and facts and statistics coming at everybody right now, and to be able to break it down the way that you did, I think is incredibly helpful. So thank you for taking the time.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for reaching out with this idea and for putting this video together. And just as a final pitch to any members watching, as you experience these loans or anything else related to this crisis and the economic recovery, please do let us know any feedback that you have on the way that it's working or not working, and other needs in the community that you see. We take really seriously the responsibility to represent you all on Capitol Hill and with the administration, and so the more we know, the better we're able to do that. So thank you guys for doing this video, and certainly more to come.